Look, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Erwin, for your introduction earlier. It's an honour to be here to speak to you today. It's a great privilege for us at CIBC to come and meet so many people in the business community here in Canada. We know it's a very interesting subject at the moment, something that I'm sure a lot of you in the room here, or most of you in the room, are only too aware of, the focus on what's happening in China and what's happening with the currency. I'd like to start off by just making some introductory remarks about what we think is happening in the economy, and then go through some slides to illustrate those points. But I know we have about 25 minutes allotted to that. I'd rather leave a bit of time at the end for you to ask questions, and I think by doing that we can get to the heart of the area that people are interested in. Everyone will have seen the GDP numbers this week out of China for the fourth quarter. They were okay. China's slowing, yes, we know that, but it's not collapsing. We term the numbers this week perhaps as the Goldilocks numbers, neither too hot or too cold. Not too hot to suggest that they're manufactured, not too cold to suggest things are worse than they have been expected to be. So relative to expectations, the misses are very small. And the market and prices for both the currency and assets in China have already well reflected those results. Economic rebalancing, of course, in China is proceeding and has been going for some time. It's going to take further for that to progress from here. But we are making progress on that. In 2015, consumption was around about 65% of growth. Unfortunately, household consumption is still less than 40% of that. So there's still some way to go for this rebalancing to be achieved, but certainly we're moving in that path. Excess credit growth has been an ongoing threat to the stability of the financial system. We're now near 210% of GDP of debt owed by households and corporates, and that's growing nearly at the same pace as GDP. So what we need to see, because we have the slower growth requires stimulus, excess capacity in the economy, which is a big overhang from the previous investment boom, that also needs to be deflated or needs to be used. And I think as we go through some slides in a moment, that's really where a lot of the pressure on the currency has come from, this exporting of this excess capacity. Of course, when we cut interest rates, and interest rates have been cut 6 times since November in 2014, we want to see what happens with lending. Lending is an issue because banks are unwilling to extend to weak credits, and strong credits don't need to be borrowing. So much like we saw in the US, that the money multiplier really hasn't been working as it should be. And so it's incumbent on other areas of stimulus, fiscal stimulus, and including a modestly weaker currency from this level, that we get the stimulus that the economy needs. Weaker currency, of course, is useful and a complementary policy tool to that. It does risk amplifying risk if that's mishandled, but we believe that the risks are contained, even though there's a lot of concern amongst, or a lot of negative sentiment around. Repayment of foreign debt has been one tenet of what we've seen as a result of the weaker currency. That's obviously a good thing, as I mentioned, moving excess capacity offshore. And what I mean by that is we have Chinese companies are buying foreign companies. So Chinese companies at home have excess capacity. They're buying foreign companies to use up some of that capacity, and thereby to strengthen their position globally. A very good example of that we've seen just in the last week was the purchase of by hire of the whiteware goods of GE for $5.5 billion in cash. Now that is capital outflow, and that's what we expect to continue as China uses its excess capacity. China looks to ameliorate its excess capacity over the next few years. A lot of talk we've had previously that China runs a capital account deficit. We heard that perhaps 18 months ago was quite a popular topic for the press, and I said, but China's had a capital account deficit for the last 10 years. It's simply the mirror image of the current account surplus. But because we've had a closed or partially closed current account, that's shown up as reserves at the central bank rather than assets in the hands of the private sector. So as we move forward to open the capital account, and that I believe that will happen over the next 5 to 6 years, we get a rebalancing of that capital account deficit. So the central bank owns the reserves now, deleverage. So they run down those reserves, and the private sector starts to buy the assets. So really the capital outflow should not really be a cause of dislocation in global markets, because all we're talking about is a change of ownership, from the public sector to the private sector. I ask people on this trip and other trips when I meet them, I say, well, what about the capital outflow? Where's it going? And I said, well, you tell me where's it going? Because look, none of the assets that we look at are going up. Commodities haven't been going up. The Canadian dollar certainly hasn't been going up. Other assets, equity assets around the world haven't been going up. So really it's a change of ownership. The money doesn't leave the system, it just changes who's the final owner of that. Now the idea just on the currency that China wants to devalue its way to prosperity, we believe is patently incorrect. But part of the result of having this capital outflow, of course, will dictate that we see the currency trade modestly weaker than the levels it is now. Apart from all the consternation about how weak the currency is really hides the fact that the currency is near unchanged on a trade-weighted basis over the last 12 to 15 months, and only modestly weaker against the US dollar during the same time. We do expect, though, given that the economy needs some more stimulus from this point, that we can see some further depreciation of the currency, and that I thought it was me for a moment, but it's someone else. I thought my voice was fading, but someone turned the volume down. So I think we can see another 3 or 5% depreciation from present levels on a trade-weighted basis. That would mean if the dollar was unchanged against other currencies from the level now, that we move through from 655 or 660 through to 675 or 680. Now I have some forecasts against the Canadian dollar on the slides here, and I'll get to those just in a moment. So I think that's probably a good point just to step through and have a look at some of the slides, and just to show you what I've been talking about where the growth in China may come from, where the growth in China will come from over the next 10 to 15 years, just what's been happening with growth, and where we think the currency may get to. First one there, I don't want to dwell too long on this. I mean, we know the story that the growth has been slowing and has been particularly stable over the last couple of years. One thing I'd like to point out, though, we're dealing with the situation where the pie of China, or the size of the economy, is made up now of different ingredients, and it's actually a bigger size pie. So talking about growth slowing, and as the FT and others like to tell us yesterday, the growth was the slowest in 25 years, is a bit of a misnomer, because growth of 7% in 2014 would be equivalent to 15% in 2009. The growth of 6.9% during 2015 is still adding a larger net amount to the global economy than it has in any previous years. Industrial production, well, we know industrial production has slowed from previous points, and I point out here, a lot of people like to use electricity usage as a proxy for industrial production, and you notice there that electricity production has in fact been, or the growth of electricity production has been negative in the last few months. So people say, well, doesn't that mean the economy is slowing more than the official numbers suggest? And I say, well, one thing we need to consider is efficiencies of use of electricity need to be considered, so you'd have to rebase that every few months or every couple of years. It's a truism, of course, that in developing or emerging economies, that the amount of energy used per dollar of GDP goes down as you develop. I put up the slide here. This is from a study by McKinsey about the infrastructure stock in China, and just what is going to happen in the next few years. People say, why doesn't China just embark on another fiscal stimulus as they did post 2008, 2009? Well, one of the reasons was that a large part of that infrastructure building was borrowing from the then 12th 5-year plan and the 13th 5-year plan that will be introduced in March. So there isn't the same infrastructure building to be done right at this moment, and China should be careful not to go down the path that Japan went down. You can see You can see up here, this is Japan at what, 180% infrastructure stock to GDP. If many of you may remember all the time of Japan's stimulus programs, the so-called bridges to nowhere and paving the rivers, and really have just got overcapacity in infrastructure stock. Notwithstanding that, China still has a lot of infrastructure building still to do. We still have a very strong plan towards urbanisation. 54% of the population now live in urban areas, up from 30% in 2000, as recently as 2005, with a goal of 60% in the cities by 2020. And all of that requires further infrastructure, and it requires further services for all those people living in those urban areas. I think a couple of interesting points from here. Again, from the same study, India has a very much lower proportion. The OECD is 78%. One thing that surprised me here, Brazil, 85%, so very high there. So China has a long way to go towards urbanisation and all the services that requires, and that will be a driver of the economy through till the next 15 and 20 years. Even with the spending that China has done on infrastructure in the last 10 years, to fulfil those requirements that we saw on the previous slide, still requires spending on infrastructure as a percentage of GDP about 6.5%. So if China was only to build the necessary infrastructure that they have planned between now and 2030, it would sustain growth at a very high pace. And this also spins off into any demand for commodities. We're not seeing the demand for industrial commodities extend at the same pace we saw post-2008, 2009, but the underlying demand, both from China and other developed economies, is certainly still there. I won't dwell on this too much, just to say that the services sector is now a larger portion. Unfortunately, the finance sector, which was a big driver of growth in the first half of 2015, and won't be contributing as much in the second half because of the slump in the stock market. Another measure of, do we think GDP is overstated or we think it's at a valid level? This is the GDP number against the Purchasing Managers Index, suggesting that even around 50, we've still got the levels that we can still sustain these levels of expansion. So the goal of having a moderately prosperous society by 2020 and having growth of, was at 6.53% every year between now and 2020 to double the average, or to double the per capita income between 2010 and 2020 is still very much achievable. I just want to get on to talk a little bit about the trade sector before we specifically look at the currency. China continues to import. So obviously there's been imports of commodities have cost a lot less in the last couple of years, and we can see from that that the biggest, push the wrong button. The biggest losers during that time have been in the economies which have been exporting commodities. So Brazil, Australia, but most of it has been about value, so lower value of commodities. Very interestingly, in this, Canada is the only major economy, or is the only major economy that we track here outside of all the big ones, has actually expanded its exports to China in the last year. And that's been really a mix of different products. Not just, there's been no one product which stands out, and that's really been a mix of different areas. Chinese exports are doing okay, not as strong. The expansion has not been as strong as we've seen in the last couple of years. And one thing that does stand out is less exports to the rest of the region has slowed down quite considerably. To the US has been at a decent pace. What we expect China to be doing by using up its excess capacity is to be exporting more. So to be buying more foreign companies and to be exporting more, to taking market share away from other exporting nations. China-Canada trade, as I said, is about even. It's been expanding at a modest pace, but nothing really sensational at this point. I think the distance is really counting against the export of a lot of minerals that had been expected previously. One thing to mention here with imports, we saw that we always have a Lunar New Year effect in January where imports are less. I'm concerned about the number here that we saw last week, the imports in December. Very difficult to look at that number and suggest that this is a number which is consistent with a slowing economy. I posed in a piece we wrote last week that some of this is over-invoicing of imports by Chinese companies in an effort to get monies offshore of China. You may remember a couple of years ago we had the over-invoicing of exports. At that time it was an attempt to get money onshore of China. This time I think we're seeing the reverse, so I think this is something to look out for over the next little while. And I don't expect anyone in the room has been doing that. I just want to use an example here just of the imports and just an example of what I think of what we believe is happening in the Chinese economy and why we're seeing some pressure on the currency. This is imports of iron ore. And I know Canada is not an exporter of iron ore, but it's an important component and a very large value component. So the imports of iron ore have been going, well, we're very strong through that very strong infrastructure building phase. Have been flat over the last couple of years. The spike up in December, which, as I mentioned, we're not convinced about that that's accurate, although maybe stock building ahead of Lunar New Year. But the price they've been paying has been much less. So on this basis, we look at this number and say, well, the economy is still growing at a similar pace because they're still importing the same amount of raw materials. People would say to me, well, surely some of that's just ending up as inventory. No, it's not. Inventories are only around 1 month of imports. But what is happening is we're seeing China exporting more steel. So it matters now when you're dealing with China. If you're an exporter to China, it matters what your marginal cost of production is. So economies like Australia are taking share away from Brazil in terms of bulk commodities. If you're an importer from China, or if you're competing with exports with China, it matters also what your cost of production is. So in this case, China taking market share away from economies like Japan or like South Korea, India, Ukraine, the steelmaking business in the US and the UK, almost long gone. So what we see from this is China, as I mentioned, China exporting its excess capacity. So it's moving offshore by exporting more. It's moving offshore by buying production of other companies like the Haier, the GE deal. And to do this, and to help with this move, a modestly weaker currency is advantageous in that strategy. So I believe a lot of what's happening in the currency is very much related to this excess capacity, to get this excess capacity offshore. And I think we're going to continue to see more of this until there's a pickup in global demand. And the trouble is not China. I mean, China is not the symptom. China's not the problem. Although it's a very easy touch point, for the media to pick up on. The problem has been, China brought forward its infrastructure spending from 2010 to 2020. It brought it forward and did it all, between 2008 and 2012. The issue in 2013 and beyond, and where we find ourselves now, is that global demand hasn't picked up as was expected. So China's strategy is to, if we built this excess capacity, is to try and get rid of it. And I think we're going to continue to see this. This is a path for further deflation and to move further. Sorry, I'm going a bit along here. Just jump forward here to where we think the currency will go. Now this is the CFET system published an index for the trade-weighted value of the currency in the purple there, and based it at 100 on 31st of December 2014. Well, if we look here, we're only back to the same level. So even though the currency has depreciated against the dollar in the red, on a trade-weighted basis, we haven't moved much at all. So given that the economy needs further stimulus from this point, we expect that an appropriate level or appropriate depreciation from this point would first be between 2 and 3% to take us back to the level where the currency first, or the dollar first started gaining against other major currencies in October, and beyond that, up to depreciation of 5% over the next 12 months. Where would that get us to? Well, here's a forecast for where we think the currency will get to, both against the CNY and CNH, out to the middle of next year, both against the dollar and both against the. I'm sorry, the second line there should be against Canada. So further, modest depreciation in the currency from where we are, and we still think the best way to approach that is to be hedging your exposure in CNY or CNH, particularly through CNH, being the liquidity that's available there, and to see it modestly weaker over the next 6 to 12 months.
My name is Brian Chan from CJ Marketing.